In this segment, we're going to talk about grief. I didn't ever imagine that choosing to research death meant that I was also choosing to research grief. But with every person that I interviewed, they either shed a tear or I shed a tear. So it was clear to me that this was a really sad topic and that we were all still very wounded. My first interview that I had lasted 26 minutes. I started my interview with letting the participant know that she could tell me whatever she felt I needed to know about the death of her father. And that I had prepared questions, but I wanted her a chance to speak first, and she started talking and didn't stop. I really don't even know when she found time to take a breath, but it was just like the gates had opened. She shared with me so many stories of loss and sadness and struggle and eventually of joy. But it was just so interesting to see her transform while telling her story. And when she was done, she and I both reached for a box of tissue at the same time, and we laughed because we didn't know exactly who should get it first. And then she ran into her bedroom and showed me a picture of her father because she wanted me to meet him. So that was my first interview, and that set the tone for all the ones to follow. Some people liked structured questions, but for those who didn't, I let them run. And even though that was against my professional methodology, the information eventually came out. They eventually answered all my questions. But I gave them the time and the space to get to those answers themselves. And I think in that regard, I honored all of their stories. For me then, in my experience after writing my dissertation, people seemed to navigate their way towards me. I was having a mammogram one day when all of a sudden the X-ray technician let me know that she was dying of cancer. And I shared with her then that I had just studied death and dying because she had asked me whether or not I was afraid of death. And I told her everything I could within those few moments of being, positioned and having my breasts one at a time, pressured and squeezed. And there was just no place for any kind of, ability to have privacy. In that experience, I was telling her everything my heart could tell me about death and dying. And by the time my exam was over, I think she felt comforted because I told her the same thing that I told my mother. You're not going to be alone. And God will make it easy. And so she was going to work up until the day she could no longer work, and I have a feeling she's no longer here. But that's just one of the many stories and one of the bizarre situations where people opened up to me about death and dying, and I think that that's what we need to be able to do. We need to be able to tell people that we're afraid of it, because of course, who wouldn't be? Regardless of who we think God is and what we think is going to happen, the fact remains that we don't know for sure. And that's what faith is. Faith is always accompanied by doubt. So I think we're okay with that. We're okay to be afraid of dying. But I also think that the fact that we can talk about it and share these worries, but also talk about how our loved ones died, that helps us to heal. The year my mother passed away, and actually right before my dog died, a few days before my dog died, I attended a dinner that was conducted by the funeral home that I had for my mother's funeral. And this was such an amazing community gesture. They invited everyone who lost a loved one that year to participate in sort of an alternative Christmas gathering. At this event, they allowed a representative from every family to get to the front of the restaurant and tell a story about their loved one. And as the stories progressed, I could feel the energy of the room change. We started laughing at these stories. These stories weren't sad. They were telling us amazing stories of these amazing people who were no longer with us physically, but were certainly there in spirit. Towards the end of the dinner, the grief counselor there talked about how he tried hard to give comfort to those who were grieving. And he said the only thing that seemed to work for him when people had regrets about how their loved ones died is the popular serenity prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change what I can, and the knowledge to know the difference. And I took this prayer to heart. I grieved for my mother for a long time. I think it was about 4 years before I truly felt like I was able to do things that she used to do with me without crying. I ended up having to need that many years to get rid of some of the stuff that she loved that was more her than me. And it took me about that many years to stop wearing her favorite bathrobe, because when I wore it, I felt connected to her. So in that lesson, I learned that grief is going to take as long as it takes. But recently, I lost another dog. And this was the dog Felix that I had gotten to kind of heal the hole in my heart when Sammy died. And what I learned by the time I lost Felix was that I needed to be able to figure out how to not be stuck in grief for so long. Even though I had lost my best friend, I still needed to carry on. I still needed to remember the lessons of that ornament that said joy. So what I did then was understand when my brain needed help. And it needed help every time I opened the door, and I needed to tell myself, he's not here. When instead my heart would be expecting to hear his bark and to see his tail wag. And I needed to use my brain to say he's not here every time I went to bed, because I used to sleep with my dog. And then at least my brain was prepared for the shock of the absence of those that I loved. So I'm not saying our brain can do everything to fix the hole in our heart, but you can certainly, while you're grieving, you can think of other things. You can remind yourself that the person is no longer here with you. And that initially helps to stop the expectation of seeing that person. But then I think you have to take the lesson from the joy ornament. You have to understand that that person lived his or her life, hopefully to its fullest. And hopefully you will be able to tell yourself that you did your best in honoring the story that that person had to tell. So again, pray for the serenity to accept what you can't change. Pray for the courage to be able to change the things you can't. Understand that you can make your own death and the deaths of those you love better. And then pray for the knowledge to know the difference between those situations. And also pray for the knowledge in how to navigate through the situation you're in. Grief is going to take as long as it takes. And I think that the people that we love that are no longer here, they deserve moments of our sadness. They deserve that energy that we emit when we are heartbroken. They deserve those tears. But I think also they want you to move forward and to continue whatever you can to make this world a better place. So grief is complicated, and grief is messy, and grief is challenging, but it's actually an important part of this whole process. So pay attention to your grief, but then also use your brain to help your heart throughout the process. Thanks.